Hey everybody. All right, let's go ahead and share my screen. Let's get started. This is the Examining a Political Reality of Language and Culture piece that is in your Being Indigenous textbook. I really like this piece and I was going to use it last week or last module in the beginning. However, my copy of the textbook wasn't here. So I put it off a week. But I really want to focus on language in this course because language is something that is so incredibly valuable, but it also shows the resilience of a culture, of a race, of a people, as well as showing how it can be oppressed and ostracized. And so I think that talking about language and the way it's claimed or reclaimed or not claimed or the way it's used in order to alienate, I think it's really, really valuable. And it's something that, especially in the fields that I research and study, is something that can be either very damaging or can be very uplifting. And so I want to kind of emphasize that. And this piece really does that. And talks about the way in which language, specifically indigenous languages, are a resistance to assimilation. It's a way in which to keep a piece of culture, but it's also something that has been stripped from so many of those cultures through processes like the schools that the US government would send indigenous children to, where they were not allowed to speak their language, and speaking their language ended up getting a lot of children harmed and assaulted. Language is also a resistance to cultural genocide, right? So the ability to speak a language that, in particular, of a people that is consistently brutalized and consistently being tried to be made extinct, really emphasizes the resilience of that culture. On the flip side, we have an astounding amount of language loss that happens and has happened in this country. Just as we have currently about 6,000 or so languages that are currently spoken in North America alone, we're likely to lose a good majority of those in my lifetime. And prior to that 6,000, there were thousands and thousands and thousands more indigenous cultures and indigenous variations that were lost in the genocidal practices of colonialism. And so that's something to just think about, the ways in which really losing a language can be losing such a huge part of the culture, because language shows what you put emphasis on, the way you relate to others. So if your language, like they gave the example of language reflecting the way they interact, right? Reflecting not having an ownership, or having an ownership to a specific thing, or having an ownership to a specific identity. And that showing exactly the way in which they use language to express how they interact as a culture and as a group. And that's important. So, Una, stop, please. They also talk about trickster tales, or these kind of indigenous, essentially, they would be very similar to things like the Grimm fairy tales or whatever for that particular culture. And essentially, theirs are wrapped in this idea of colonialistic forces, or some force coming and trying to destroy their way of life, destroy their culture, destroy their people. And that because they are so strong, because they are such a so connected to whether it be the earth, whether it be their own culture, whatever it may be, that they can rise up and still remain standing, remain whole, even after so much trauma to that particular culture. Now, the fact that again, these trickster tales are headed up in this idea of annihilation and resilience to that annihilation. Shows in and of itself how colonialistic ideologies have shaped and molded these particular cultures and how they think about themselves, what they think of their language, and how that language has become a part of that resilience. The US and Canada governments have been very, very brutal and ruthless to Indigenous people of North America. And there have been multiple wars fought. And it's interesting because they brought up in this book specific battles that Indigenous people won and pushback that was successful. And just like we don't hear a lot about slave rebellions that were successful or that ended in a way that allowed some slaves to become free or things of that nature, we don't celebrate, we tend to not celebrate the battles in which white people lost. And that's because of who's telling the stories and who's being prioritized in the stories. And it's something that as we unlearn or relearn the ways of which history operated, it's something that has to be part of the conversation. And it's something that, again, is part of these resilience stories, these resilience tales tied into Indigenous practice. They also talk about creating an inaccurate or myth-like image of political subjugation. And I want to talk about this because this is still happening, and it's something to the effect of if white people tell the stories of how they defeated savage, and I'm going to use those in air quotes because in no way, shape, or form is that what I am I reflecting my own personal ideas about Indigenous people. But if they're creating this myth-like atmosphere of ridding the world of an evil culture or ridding the world of a savage person or savage people, then what they're doing is creating them as this savior, this battle war torn soldier, right? As opposed to an evil force that came in genocidal raids took over multiple Indigenous persons, right? That wouldn't sound so mythical, and so they wouldn't sound so great in the grand scheme of things because they would sound a lot like Hitler. And we don't look at Hitler as this good guy, right? Well, in similar ways, for most Indigenous cultures, the US government is their Hitler, right? Except it still gets to do it. And essentially, it would be like if Hitler won that war, right? So, and I say this not lightly, like, and the connection of the two, it's an easy connection to make, but on the flip side, there are also a lot of nuances that make the colonialistic genocide of Indigenous persons different than Nazi Germany. So don't say I'm saying they're exactly like, because I'm not, but I'm making a comparison as to how leadership of someone who wins that does this egregious thing comes out as this like myth, like almost idyllic situation versus a leadership that is committing genocides that has been ostracized or have lost, looks back on their history and thinks, oh my God, we were the villain, right? And that's the difference. And the connections here I want you to see. The United States courts and Canada courts interpret law in ways, and they give the example of our Supreme Court and its legal structure in very, even still in ways that keep Indigenous persons trapped within really outdated and colonialistic laws. And that's going to continue, right? Because there is these distinctions, and because Indigenous persons have essentially been, as a society, white people and those within our society have essentially been okay with this idea of people living on reservations within their own lands. And because so much of the problems that creates and the problems for which celebrating the US government for doing that um, creates icky feelings if we do it in an invisible way where we don't talk about the cost, the human life cost, the indigenous cost that is that particular colon let's try that again, colonistic force, then colonialistic, there we go, colonialistic force that was and continues to be the US government, then we don't, then we have to do a lot more deep diving. Then we have to have conversations about Christopher Columbus. We have to have conversations about Thanksgiving holiday. We have to have conversation about what statues we put up. We have to have conversations about the fact that we're still drilling for oil. We're still ruining sacred places for indigenous people. We're still isolating indigenous people to particular sets of land. Excuse this. Hold on. I don't know. So a puppy heard something. But we're still isolating these people in ways that if another country was doing this, or when another country does this, we go in and say, hey, this is not a democracy. You need to fix it. Well, we're doing the same thing, but as long as we sweep it under the rug and continue to not talk about it and continue to let it be this invisible thing that happens, then what we get is the status quo, right? And that status quo continues to leave Indigenous persons incredibly at a disadvantage in this country and in Canada and in so many other places. All right. Again, language has also been something that has defined nations before, but because within this country, Indigenous peoples fall under this category where they don't get to be their own nation, but they also get to be their own entity, but they also don't have their own, like they don't have nation state protections. They don't have, they're not free of the US government overwatch, oversight, etc. Their lands are not theirs. And that's something that when we think about it, causes us to kind of pause, right? Because in the United States, language isn't something that denotes country because technically we have no national language. Now, I say that, but I say technically because with the way white supremacy is wrapped into the United States and the way it functions, English is definitely socially the national language. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about how terms and how language works to reflect a culture. But some other things I want to kind of bring that point home is how many terms you have for a certain object, for a certain thing, for a certain activity, right? Depending on that, you may end up with showing its importance within a society, within a culture, right? And so if a child only has, like in the English language, a child has, you can be a kid, you can be a kiddo, you can be a child, you can be a little one, you can be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are numbers of names for children, right? With the connotation that children are something that require attention and or are something we express prioritization of. But a cow is a cow. I mean, you can call it maybe a heifer, you can call it a couple of other things, but really a cow is really all it's called in the United States. But that might not be the same for some cultures that maybe prioritize cattle because of the economic benefit it has or what have you. And that language might show multiple different words for that particular being, for that particular animal. In the same way, words themselves have multiple meanings, right? We have all sorts of innuendos. We have all sorts of words that are going to mean one thing in one context in one kind of sentence or in one kind of social space and mean something else in a different social space. There's a reason for that. It's because those multiple meanings express essentially motive or intent. And the same happens when it comes to indigenous languages, right? But if we only have certain people translating it, then it might lose some of its ability to create that multiple meanings, right? So generationally with any language, um, different generations are going to prioritize different things depending on what's part of their life and the historic context that they live in. So you're going to have new slang words, you're going to have new language context. And in that, if you don't have people continuing to interpret the language, then those things get lost. And it's something that when we talk about language loss, we also lose parts of a language when it's not spoken by a wide variety of individuals within that culture. Um, and again, I just want to mention that we have lost thousands upon thousands of indigenous languages in the United States, and we are continuing to lose them at an astounding rate. And without really people investing in not losing those, then that's going to continue to happen. And when you lose, when a culture loses a language indigenous to it, they lose pieces of its history that never quite translate the same, or never quite have the same intent, or never show again what they prioritize and what they don't, because that those, no matter how many words it has for one thing, if the people who are translating it only have one word for it, it's only going to have one word in those translations. And that's something that we as a human people globally are going to have to start thinking about what it means to not have those languages written down, not have those languages continued, and what that's going to mean for the cultural genocide of these people. All right, so that's the end of that one. I will be back. We've got two more and then we're done for this module, okay?